Okay, Twitch has accepted the stream.
Okay.
YouTube has accepted the stream. Facebook has accepted the stream. Okay, you ready to go on the air?
Sure.
Set your timer to 55.
Okay. Now, what happens if you're not readily available? What do you? Should I just
No one will be
keep talking to?
yeah, nobody will be able to let you into the show. Can you text him and find out if he is or isn't going to be?
Oh, let me see. Uh, one moment. Unless you make me a co-host for just for this hour, I could let him in if you're not there. Um, okay, I'm just letting him know. Don't worry about it. Okay, all right, we're good.
Okay, fine. Okay, so you got your timer set to 55?
Yes.
Okay, start the timer.
Mm-hmm.
Is it counting backwards or however you're doing it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, now clap your hands near your microphone, and when you clap your hands, you're on the air.
Good evening and afternoon. Welcome to Talking Peace. I am your host, Deidra EmEl, Executive Director of the Western New York Peace Center. And today we are going to be talking about war and hunger. Uh, and before we begin, we always like to give a Thanksgiving. We are thankful for the earth, the plants and the trees, the animals, the sea, the ocean, the sea creatures, our insects, um, our planets, and the sun and the moon and the stars. We are thankful for love and motion in justice and in truth. We are thankful for people helping one another and existing on this planet and giving us a chance to show love to them. We are thankful for all things in our indigenous brothers and sisters way. We would say Nyahweh after our Thanksgiving, and our audience in the circle would say Nyo. Samina. Nyo.
No.
Thank you. And in our African traditions, we also say Ashe or Amen or so be it. Ashe. So thank you. So I wanted to introduce you all to our guest today is Dr. Samina Raja of UB School of Architecture and Design, all around community activists in food security and land sovereignty and food security throughout not just Buffalo, but it's just been an ongoing project of Dr. Samina's, and she's just been doing a wonderful work in building a network to connect people, food, and resources. And so we have her on today. Welcome, Dr. Samina.
It's my pleasure. It's lovely to be in conversation with you. Thank you for having me here.
No problem. It's always wonderful talking to you. I always just after we even if we see each other, what have you, and it's always a wealth of knowledge and information that I can just glean from you. And I'm really excited about tonight. So we're talking about the effects of war on food security.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know what values do you bring? Do you want to hold in this conversation tonight?
Mm-hmm. So, an important value that I hold generally, but it's important right now as well, is in the belief that all humans have the right to exist with dignity and to their full potential and have the freedom to be their full selves. So that is a really core value that is important to me personally, but also professionally, and drives much of the work that I do. And of course, you and I have had conversations about this, and I know that that is important to you as well.
Wow. I think the value I want to bring to this conversation or hold in this conversation is connection, helping us make a connection of what we do, how we vote, how we eat, how we do things, how it's connected to each other and the larger world. Like some people say, our last show was on voting, so I guess that's kind of still fresh in my mind as far as making change. But they say we vote with our dollars, and we vote with our plates, and what we choose to, and not always a choice as well, but what we have access to and what we gravitate towards to be involved in our lives and to fulfill our needs, So connectivity and making informed choices, I'm hoping will spark our conversation as well. I think a lot of people, when we think about hunger, don't think about war, or the peace of a society or a country. What do you think about that? What do you understand as far as that connection between war and hunger?
It's a great question, and if I may, I'm also reflecting on the values that you began with and I began with. So if I may, I want to go back with it, because connection, which you presented, is a terrific one for us to center our conversation around, and also the dignity of life, because both of those are tied to the question that you just asked me. So if we ground our conversation in those values of connection and human dignity for all, human dignity for all humans, then we would approach the conversation about war and hunger differently. And the reason I say that is because war is something that is an episode or an event or a series of events that connects people in the wrong way. So there are positive connections and then there are negative connections, and war is one of those connections that we would much rather not have, because in fact, as you are asking in the question, war connects people through hunger. And it's not. So war is in some ways the kind of connection that undermines human dignity and undermines people's ability to be well-fed and food sovereign, and which I will talk about in a minute. But I wanted to begin by acknowledging that the value that you presented in the conversation really, I think, illustrates, offers a beginning answer to the question that you asked me. That said, two things come to mind. One is making sure that we have a chance to really think through what war means. What is the definition of a war? is war something that people imagine gets fought on a battlefield, or is war something that happens on intersections in our neighborhoods? And I would argue that war today in 2022 looks very different than World War One, World War Two, or the kinds of wars and battles that people understand. And in fact, I was looking up some data in preparation for our conversation today, Deidra, and those kinds of wars have decreased globally. But what hasn't decreased is suffering. And what hasn't decreased is the lack of people's dignity and their access to food. So I just want to just make sure that we allow ourselves to understand war the way it ought to be understood today, not just how it was understood in the 1940s. So in my mind, war is something that is certainly that involves aggression and fighting and conflict, but that it also gets waged. It happens in very different ways. So I'll begin there. And then your question was its link to hunger. I think a very present example that's on many people's radar or mind is the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I will begin with that. And I'll give an example, but just because it's going to be familiar to a lot of people that are probably going to listen to this show. So the violence between Russia and Ukraine is between what we would call two nation states that are in conflict right now, and Russia is the aggressor. And through Ukraine, we are learning that war doesn't close at the border of a country, that kind of a war. And specifically in Ukraine's case, many people who don't maybe think about food all the time in the sense of where does it come from, we're used to it in some neighborhoods anyway, being in a supermarket, not in all neighborhoods, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But Ukraine is a big producer of certain fundamental things globally. And I think that is important for people to understand that might be listening to this, because it's one example. And I'll come back to your really, I think, provocative question about the connection between war and hunger. So Ukraine is a pretty big supplier and grower of food, but I have some numbers that I'll share and then some stories that I'll come to. So the numbers, first I want to say, having said that there are many different kinds of wars, the first number that I want to offer listeners is that in 2020, which is just 2 years ago, there were 155 million people in 55 countries and territories that lived in conflict settings. That's 155 million people. And that's a pretty sizable number of people. And then bring you back to one specific acute situation, which is Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is a big producer. We all know from all the pictures and stories about Ukraine, sunflowers are a big deal in Ukrainian culture, but they are also one of the biggest producers of sunflower oil in the world. Also one of the biggest exporters of that for the globe. So that's kind of because everybody recognizes sunflower as an image tied to Ukraine. But maybe people who might be listening may not know that Ukraine is, in 2019, was also a substantial producer of wheat, the stuff that goes in our bread. Yeah, substantial producer of maize, aka corn. 16% of the global exports come from Ukraine for that. And of course, some of the food products, they also come from Russia. Like 14% of global exports of wheat come from Russia. So you have two countries in conflict and disrupting the supply chain for that. is a kind of a direct pathway that impacts food. But I would say that there are other ways in which war impacts hunger that is less obvious. And so I'm going to go to those stories now, having talked about the direct example of Ukraine because it draws people's attention. Before I do that, I do want to say that we should be concerned about war in Ukraine for the sake of people in Ukraine, not just because of what it will do to the rest of the world. War is just a bad idea, period.
Yes.
Not just for others, but for people who live there. But I thought that it would be good for people to hear those numbers. Okay. That said, there are other kinds of conflicts that don't come to the attention, I think, especially of a US audience, because our press tends to be sensationalist, doesn't have patience to cover topics that require a lot of attention. So Ukraine is not, unfortunately, not the first place that has experienced violence in recent history. We have conflicts in a lot of sub-Saharan areas, and those are also worthy of our attention, but hasn't drawn as much attention in the US press. So I began with Ukraine because people understand that, but I think people also need to understand the numbers of where actually hunger persists in the world and overlays with conflict. So for example, if you look globally at where severe food insecurity is by region, it's actually in sub-Saharan Africa. And we cannot just focus on one part of the world because of the really remarkable value you grounded us in, which was we are connected as people and as a globe and as a planet. And so we ought to also be paying attention to what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't skip that. There are wars happening in Syria, Afghanistan. Right now, we wouldn't technically call it war, but what is happening in Iran to women in particular is also violence and also impacts hunger. So I began by answering your question by saying there are many kinds of wars. So one that I know, unfortunately, a little bit too much about is in my own ancestral community of Kashmir, which is a conflict region and has been for many decades. And so I can give very detailed examples, also numbers, but I'll switch to a story for a minute. So what it looks like when conflict happens, and I'm careful about using that word rather than war because people have different definitions of different things. But in Kashmir, which is a conflict setting, if you are a baker, and you wake up early in the morning to go knead bread for the neighborhood, we have a tradition of bakers, then you can be shot dead on your way to the bakery, which actually happened not too long ago. So it was a woman who got up super early at dawn to go to her work. Her son was driving her to work, to her bakery. And soldiers that were patrolling shot at the car point blank range and killed her. So when we talk about hunger and war, it's not an abstract idea. There's a direct impact. So first is that people who do food work are at risk, and I'll come to hunger in a second. So bakers, farmers, people who grow fruit and work with trees and soil and land. So I give you an example of a woman baker in Kashmir who was killed. The other way that it happens is that farmers who work in the fields suffer collective punishment because troops will go in and burn the fields down in a conflict setting. And so then not only does the farmer get impacted, but also the neighborhood that depends on that food. So in a conflict setting, the ordinary act of growing food, baking bread, serving the neighborhood, then going and buying your own food becomes really precarious. It results in straight up death. And the phrase that is very common sometimes, and I think you were alluding to this earlier, when we eat, when people nourish their bodies and are not hungry, they are actually depending on something that we like sometimes use the phrase food system or food infrastructure. Somebody works the soil, somebody plants a seed, somebody harvests it, somebody moves it to a neighborhood and then prepares. Our mothers, grandmothers, fathers cook that meal and serve the children. So that is the food system. In a war setting, all of those pieces are disrupted. The growing is disrupted, the movement of food is disrupted, and by doing all of that, you create precarity. So that's the downside, immediate downside of war or conflict of the people who are in that setting. The not so clear story, there's a second part to this, and I do want to mention that, and I'm going back to Kashmir. I work with collard growers in Kashmir, by the way. I also work with collard growers in the United States, so it's a lovely coincidence. But to stay in Kashmir, which is the site of this conflict, where there is all of these deaths and collective punishment at the hands of, in this particular case, troops. It's important to know that in Kashmir, people continue to survive. People continue to feed their families. So my mother, for example, continues to feed her family. And the question is, in a war, how does that happen? In a conflict, how does that happen? And I will bring this home now to Buffalo. So I began by saying war looks very different in different places. If we go to particular neighborhoods in Buffalo, I would say there are some forms of violence there. We might not give it the technical definition of war, but it is in some ways chronic war. You completely disallow people to lead full lives, lives of dignity. That is a form of chronic war. In that case too, and I know you had somebody on the show who talked about the east side of Buffalo, where we don't have grocery stores the way we do in other parts of Buffalo. I would call that a chronic violence. If not the technical definition of war, that is also chronic violence. So what do people do in that case? What do people do in Kashmir? My observation is even in extreme violence, extreme war, extreme conflict or chronic violence, there are people and families and communities that don't stop doing what they know to do well. And I've certainly learned that about this country, that there are communities that do that. Also in Kashmir, pretty much every family grows their own collards. So if you were to ask, given, so I forgot to mention this, there's been a conflict in Kashmir since 1947. It's the most militarized region in the world, where people in uniformed, people who are in uniform have actually perpetrated significant crimes against Kashmiris. So there are mass graves, there's conflict. I grew up in that setting, so I remember not being allowed to step out of the home to go to a grocery store as a teenager. I've seen dead bodies. I mean, stuff that really nobody should see it. But even in that context, how do Kashmiris survive? Even in the context of chronic violence on the east side, how do grandmothers take care of their grandchildren? And so there's a negative side to war, which I already talked about. Food supply is being undermined. There's chronic hunger and undernourishment, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We need to get the region right. But how do people actually manage to survive? And the lovely example that I want to share is I have observed that even in those very violent settings, that there are women in particular, but also men, who grow food for their families. And that practice in resistance to war and conflict is the practice of reclaiming what we would call food sovereignty. So the attempt to build our food systems in a way that we can withstand the negative impact of war on hunger? That's a very long answer to your short question. I'm going to stop because I'm sure you have lots of questions.
No, you're answering them already, and it's beautiful. And um, yeah, you're already on it. I'm speechless in a sense that, like I said, when I talk to you, so much just great information. It's like digging all this wisdom, from a well, just I just enjoy talking to you. And you have so much to share, and I would love, for you to continue to share. I think you've already answered a couple of my other questions. And I like the point that you brought home was, like, what is war? My husband has a shirt that says, there's a war on the poor,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And, like you said, what does violence look like? What does war look like? And it's not always physical, army, combat, type of thing. War, and conflict, can be through economics, it's, through our political systems, it's through, redlining, it's through, these are all violence. And what is war? It's violent, so it doesn't have to be physically violent to be violent. And you encroach your agenda, on someone else and affect their humanhood, their humanity, their safety, and livelihood. I think that's that's violence, and one of the forms of violence. And so I'm really glad that you brought that home. What are you doing in all your projects and over the years have done to help bring about peace in this war on the poor and food sovereignty?
It's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer. So I guess I should begin by clarifying for folks. You mentioned that I'm in the School of Architecture and Planning, and people might wonder, what does an architect/planner have to do with any of this? So for clarification, I was trained as a civil engineer, and was really interested in building. But of course, as I shared, I grew up in a region where people's homes were being destroyed. And there was a conflict. There were shoot at sight orders. You couldn't leave, go to school. You would get, killed on the street. So in that setting, what would civil engineering do? And what would my role and contribution be? And that was a question that I wrestled with. When I was training I was in my PhD program at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I had the pleasure of working with an ethicist named Jerry Kaufman. He was focused on planning ethics. And I had the complete accidental privilege of working with him and really started asking, why am I learning to be a planner and what's the point of civil engineering? This is a roundabout way to answer your question, and realize that the purpose of urban planning or engineering or any of these fields that are about building communities or neighborhoods really should be about human well-being. So I'm glad you actually asked that question about my values. So it was very clarifying that the purpose of urban planning should be to create places and communities where people can lead full lives. That is technically also the definition that American Planning Association uses, some form of that, to describe what a planner does.
Wow.
So for me, that was a call to action. So in my work, the way that has showed up is trying to use my scholarship and research and data and documentation to support communities to make the changes to bring about justice and peace. So I think of peace as very connected to justice. It is not possible to really seek an ideal peace unless there is fairness, both in the process and in the outcome. So in Buffalo, where I have lived since 2001, that work has showed up in the form of working with community partners to strengthen their food work, working with public sector partners to help them understand better why food is an important public infrastructure for the city of Buffalo. Really doing my best with my students and with my research lab, which is called the UB Food Lab in our community, to make sure that our community partners have the data that they know that they need. And in fact, you didn't say this, but Deidra, you and I have known each other actually from the year that I arrived in Buffalo, because you were also working in the food space.
Yeah. 2002.
So, yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that was the same year you arrived in Buffalo.
Pretty much, because I was looking for community partners. So to answer your question, to wrap it up, that's kind of generally how I think have tried to support peace and justice work. For me, that they go together with one more thing, which is mercy and grace. We all make mistakes, so peace, justice, mercy, grace, all together. But recently, a project that I'm very excited about, and I know you have supported that, and I hope people learn about it, is that with a group of partners that work primarily to serve the east side of Buffalo, we are working on something called growing food policy from the ground up, meaning how do we build urban agriculture policy in the city of Buffalo in a way that centers the experiences of growers of color. And Allison Dohoney, who's a farmer on the east side, she, along with a whole bunch of other partners, including Miss Gail, who's the founder of Freedom Gardens. I'm sure you must have had her on the program.
Yeah, but we do co-host another program together on another station.
Okay.
So I will have her on soon.
We launched in what year are we in? 2022, a program called Seeding East Buffalo. And I would say right now, I'm very, very proud of that program because, I mean, it was led by Allison. We were just supporting it. And it trained and worked with 12 Black growers from the east side to support them into their journey to promote food sovereignty and learn how to grow with Allison on the east side, which people often see from a deficit point of view. But here are 12 people who are taking it in their hand to grow good food and heal and build community. I'm very proud of that. Proud of them.
Wonderful.
I'm along for the ride.
How long was the program?
This was the first year we piloted it. Growing food policy from the ground up is now in its third year. And the way it worked is that we first did for 2 years partnership building and research, including on the east side, in 7 of the 14 neighborhoods on the east side, and then learned what is it that people would like, what is it that they want, and what could we do as a partnership. And then this program ran through the summer, but people were selected earlier, so there was a whole selection process. It ran through the summer, and the Seeding East cohort is still in touch, and we hope to stay in touch with them and build their capacity to continue to do what they are interested in doing. So I
So,
think
go ahead.
I think it was 8 weeks total, but Allison remembers the full duration better than me.
Okay. Okay. So once they finish with the program, what should they know how to do? Or what skills now do they have?
That's, that's a great question because I asked them this question. So, one of the things we try to do is our community partners lead the action on the ground, and then the food lab documents what happened. So, my team documents so that we learn in the process in a very systematic way so that if we made any mistakes or if something didn't work, we can pivot because we all make mistakes. But some of the things that they talked about that they learned, so I'm just going to echo those back. First of all, they loved building relationships. They talked about connections with others in the community because they were not aware. Some of them didn't know there was an agricultural pavilion at Juneteenth. Some of them didn't know that there were other people like them. Pretty much everybody talked about how they learned about how to take care of soil differently. And they learned about composting and how to do that. Many of them talked about learning how to harvest differently. But I would say composting was like a number one, aha, oh, I can do this. Many of them, if not all, also got a bed from the Freedom Gardens program, so they're also Freedom Gardeners now. And they participated in the Juneteenth Pavilion and were excited. Some of them reported they didn't know, for example, Black leadership in food work in the United States, but also in Buffalo. We had an exhibit about Black women's leadership in food work in Buffalo. So they were excited about that because some of them were not familiar with that. So I would say technical skills around growing, but also a broader awareness of why that work is meaningful, I thought was really powerful.
Oh, that is so awesome. Because I was around Miss Gail while while she was doing, some of her teachings. She was teaching some of the classes, I believe, right? Or
yeah, she did. Rebecca did a session on policy. So one of our goals for the fellows is also to center. They can do amazing things, but we collectively have power. So your point about voting is so important. I think individually we can all do a lot, but we also have the opportunity to change systems through voting and through policy. And Rebecca did a lesson or session on Farm Bill and why that is important, and that was very well received. And just learning more about the roots of agriculture in this country and why it's connected to Black liberation was really important.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And I'm excited to, I hope they're able to come to our annual dinner. And so as the audience know, the Western New York Peace Center is having our 55th annual dinner, November 11th. And our seating fellows are invited to come and listen to Leah Penniman as the keynote speaker and to meet her and hopefully have a book signed and so on. So I really, love the idea of being for the fellows and everyone really being inspired just by this event and being inspired by all the projects and wonderful solutions that are happening through, in Buffalo and through Dr. Samina's work. And I wanted to know what was your take on Leah when did you meet Leah Penniman, and what was your connection with her in your work?
It's a great question. So first of all, people are in for a treat with Leah coming to Buffalo, and there's a lot that I can say about her. But I'll begin by saying that I think I touched on the incredible history of leadership and sustenance and contributions of Black people in agriculture in the United States and people of color in general, but also specifically Black people. And I, as a researcher, I'm very privileged to know about it because I research it and I study it. And that is not an opportunity that everybody has, and I get that. I have the privilege of learning about the fact that one of the first land trusts in the United States was started by a group of Black leaders in Georgia called the New American Communities Land Trust, led by Mr. and Mrs. Sherrod. Mr. Sherrod unfortunately passed away recently, but that was the first agricultural land trust, and in fact inspired the land trust movement in the United States. So I have the privilege of knowing that and learning from Mrs. Sherrod, but that's because I'm a researcher. So I'm always trying to explain to people why it's important to understand history and all of this stuff. But I don't always see that excitement in people. And then along comes this book called Farming While Black. And I look at it and I think to myself, wow, this is incredible, because it is written in a way that it is written by a farmer, by a Black farmer, for Black people, and in a way that is a very practical guide, but connects to bigger questions around liberation and why it's connected to people's ancestry and their own traditions, and help them uncover and own their own practices. As somebody who's an indigenous Kashmiri, if I had a book that said Farming While Kashmiri, or Eating in the Face of Bullets, or something like that, it would be very, very powerful for me. Maybe I'll have to write that book. But see Leah's book and seeing its impact on my students and on my Black grower colleagues was just incredible. And then what I learned from the book itself is the fantastic way in which she did the research, but also grounded it in the life experience and stories of people's ancestry and life, and made it really practical to today. That, I think, was for me very powerful, and not shying away from broader questions about structural racism and injustice in our food system.
Right.
It was very timely, and I think it was also important because she illustrates, and by the way, we gave the book to, that was curriculum for our Seeding East fellows before she knew you were inviting her, but we gave everybody, that was a book that they read.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we did. She doesn't know that either.
Wow.
But we did. So the other beautiful thing I think in the book is that she talks about restoring Afro-Indigenous practices of agriculture. And sometimes, in research and in scholarship, we talk about different ways of knowing. And it's a big myth to presume that there's only one way of knowing. In fact, the most sound scholarship comes from many ways of knowing. That's how that's how we reach truth. And she does that. She offers one way of knowing, which is grounded in traditions and lived experience. And I found that very powerful. And then I had the pleasure of meeting her because she made the effort to come to Buffalo and speak with the Buffalo Food Equity Network several years ago. So it was a pleasure to learn more from her and learn about her work. And also, I appreciate her approach towards building up people. So I think Western New York Peace Center picked an incredible person, and Western New York is in for a treat with her being here and speaking to our community.
Well, I'm very excited about meeting her, and as I have been in the food, food justice in different ways throughout the years, and I'm kind of like coming not full circle per se, but it's like how traditionally land has to rest in certain times and certain seasons. It's kind of like certain parts of my activism I had to let rest while deal with others, and so I'm glad to kind of come back into more of the circle of farming and food sovereignty and connection. And I'm just like, I have a farm. We need, we gotta, get to the next level here because, I love putting my hands in the soil and I love talking to plants. And so I'm really excited and just humbled for her to be able to come. And I can't believe it's a week away. So, and I just keep hearing, just how, just down to earth she is. And we'll have the Juneteenth Agricultural Pavilion also there in a very smaller format, but hopefully for people to have information about the Buffalo Food Equity Network members and what they're doing. And we have, local food, local veggies, hopefully coming from Allison's fruits and veggies. So I just feel like it's just going to be a big family event, really big family event.
That's how it should be. I forgot to mention, in case people are interested, in addition to being this author of this book that I was really moved by, Leah is also the founder of Soul Fire Farms. So she's both a doer and a thinker and an organizer. She's many things. So just want to make sure that people are aware that she also is the co-founder of Soul Fire Farm, which is about honoring Afro-Indigenous practices, but also building the capacity around the country of doing work to end food apartheid. So,
right. Yeah, she does so much education on the farm and outside of the farm.
Yep.
I've learned, so I'm just so excited about that. And, and urban farming and larger farming, acreage, farming, so it's a difference, going from the urban, from the small gardener to urban farming to, acres of land. And she has shared, many workshops and so on every year to help people, get accustomed to get to know how to do that. So yeah, it's really been a pleasure talking with you, Dr. Samina. I wanted to know what can people do now to get in if they wanted to get into more of food sovereignty and dealing with food apartheid and so on. What can they do to start to get involved?
So we're talking specifically in Western New York, and I would say a little bit of a hint is in the question you asked me earlier. You asked about the connection between war and food. I would flip it around and say food is actually a lever to end conflict.
How so?
So food is, it illustrates, working in the food space is an illustration of what is already not working in our society. So in Western New York, we had a colossal tragedy on May 14th, where people were going about their business of shopping for food, and they are dead. And it put a spotlight on racism. It also put a spotlight on what was the landscape in which that racism unfolded. the fact that there's only one supermarket in that area of the city. So I would say that Western New Yorkers can think about food as a lever for bigger social transformation. It's not only about the food. It's about something bigger than that, which is why, Deidra, you and I and others who work in the food space repeatedly use the term food sovereignty. There's a reason for that. We're not talking only about ending the physical sensation of not having food in our bellies. We're talking about using food in a way that allows us to transform places and communities so people can lead full lives. So food sovereignty is about creating conditions where people can control their food system. The term food sovereignty came from peasants in Latin America who said we should be able to control the terms of our food system. Who owns the land? Who benefits from it? Who makes money from it? Who decides what to grow and how it heals our bodies? So Western New Yorkers have to, first of all, understand the distinction between terms such as hunger and food sovereignty, one. And then I think they have to ask who are the actors that are working in the food space in Western New York and support them. To use your words, join the family. Don't go about it by yourself, because that does not respect the work that has already been done in Western New York. So I will rattle off some names now for people who might be new to this space. And then, because I'm a researcher, I'll throw out a data source. So there are organizations working for Black food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty in Western New York. So you can consider supporting those organizations. For example, Buffalo Freedom Gardens, founded by Miss Gail Wells. People can consider supporting, and by support I don't mean just only money, volunteering your time, offering in-kind assistance. I know Miss Gail would love it. Allison Dehoney's organization, Go Green Buffalo, African Heritage Food Cooperative, Alex Wright's trying to bring good food to the East Side longer than it's been in the spotlight. So there are many that are doing that. On the West Side, Massachusetts Avenue Project that people do know about. So there are lots. So now, because I can't remember all of them and I don't want to leave out anybody, Feed Buffalo, which is about dignity and food for people, halal food. I'm going to give a data source for people so that they remember it. And it is called, there are two different data sources. So if you are in the city of Buffalo, or really anywhere, and you want to find out about food conditions on the East Side specifically, you can look at bit.ly, which is bit.ly/, and then all in one word, East Buffalo Food and Health. That will take you to a dashboard that will provide a listing of organizations that are doing food justice work on the East Side, and you can directly find their contact information and support them. If you are looking for something broader in Western New York, so for example, we have some indigenous farms, Native American farms, that you want to support their indigenous food sovereignty work, then please go to bit.ly/Food Future Western New York, which is a 9-county portal with data on 9 counties in Western New York. So East Side and Western New York. And as always, feel free to email the Food Lab email account, which is foodsystems@ap.buffalo.edu, and somebody will answer.
Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I can't wait to replay this and just soak in all the extra, all the information. This has really been a wonderful hour with you, Dr. Samina, and I look forward to seeing you next Friday, November 11th, 2022. And are you going to come out to the lunch as well? Are you
Um,
going to
I am going to follow up with you separately. I can't say it on air.
Okay. No problem, no problem. Just excited.
I am
But
excited. Thank you. This was lovely, Deidra.
yeah, this is great. So we got to have you on again, because again, I've been working on one end of things or another, but even for me in the last few years, I've been just understanding the connection of, of war and hunger and peace and and human needs and so on. So it's becoming more and more apparent, connecting these dots, especially through COVID and all these other tragedies, recent tragedies that has been happening. So, well, thank you so much for coming on, and you all have been listening to Talking Peace, and I am your host, Deidra EmEl, and we have been talking peace with Dr. Samina Raja. And please reach out to her if you're interested in learning more about UB's community food lab. Did I have it right? Community food lab, or is it the
It's
other way around?
called the Food Systems Planning and Healthy Communities Lab. It's too long a name. We
Yeah,
gotta
that lab.
shorten it. Just UB
I've been
Food Lab.
short. I've been shortening it for you for not.
I like Community Food Lab, Deidra. I might change the name.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, so just thank you so much. And remember to go to wnypeace.org for more information about anything that the Peace Center is doing. And I'm so excited about the Peace Center just getting back to some of our roots in food sovereignty. And I don't know if you remember World on Your Plate, which we were co-sponsoring and organizing some years ago. And I would love to see that, reconnected and see us doing that again. We stopped during COVID, but we would love to pick that back up and to, work with you, collaborate with you, again on that. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Good night.
So now we are